Why Ethiopia was never colonized, the African exception. In 1914, when European powers controlled 90% of Africa, two countries stood defiantly independent, Liberia and Ethiopia. But while Liberia had American backing, Ethiopia achieved something extraordinary. It defeated a European colonial army in pitched battle and forced the world to respect its sovereignty. This is the story of how one African nation refused to bow and why that refusal changed the course of history. The foundation, what made Ethiopia different. Unlike most African societies, during the 19th century, Ethiopia wasn't just a collection of villages or chieftains. It was already a functioning empire with deep historical roots stretching back over 2,000 years. When Europeans arrived with their maps and ambitions, they encountered something they hadn't expected, a state that looked and acted like their own. Ethiopia had been trading with the outside world since ancient times. The kingdom of Aksum controlled trade routes between the Roman Empire and India. Christianity arrived in 330 AD, making Ethiopia one of the world's oldest Christian nations. This wasn't some backward society Europeans could easily dismiss. This was a civilization with its own written language, complex bureaucracy, and imperial traditions. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church played a crucial role in creating national identity. For over 1,600 years, it served as the backbone of Ethiopian culture, preserving the Ge'ez script and providing a unifying force that transcended ethnic boundaries. When foreign invaders came, they weren't just attacking territory, they were attacking a sacred way of life that millions were willing to die for. The geographic advantage, nature's fortress. Ethiopia sits on a massive highland plateau, often called the roof of Africa. Most of the country lies above 1,500 meters, with some peaks reaching over 4,500 meters. For invading armies, this created nightmare logistics. European forces were used to fighting in coastal regions with reliable supply lines. In Ethiopia's mountains, every bullet, every grain of food, every piece of equipment had to be carried up treacherous slopes by human or animal power. The thin air exhausted foreign troops, while Ethiopians, born at altitude, moved with ease. The terrain also favored guerrilla warfare. Deep valleys and rocky outcrops provided perfect ambush sites. Ethiopian forces could disappear into familiar landscapes, while foreign armies stumbled through unmarked paths. It's like trying to invade Switzerland, except bigger, higher, and defended by people who had been fighting mountain warfare for centuries. The geography also reduced disease pressure. Higher elevations meant fewer malaria-carrying mosquitoes, giving Ethiopian forces a health advantage over tropical adapted Europeans. While colonial armies in West Africa lost thousands to disease, Ethiopia's highlands provided natural protection. The mastermind, Emperor Menelik II's strategy. When Menelik II became Emperor of Ethiopia in 1889, Europe was in the middle of the scramble for Africa. He understood immediately that traditional methods wouldn't work against industrial warfare. Menelik's genius lay in his comprehensive modernization program. He didn't just buy weapons, he transformed Ethiopia's entire military structure. He imported modern rifles from France and Russia, established training programs for his officers, and created a centralized command system that could coordinate massive armies across difficult terrain. But weapons were only part of his strategy. Menelik embarked on diplomatic campaigns that would make Machiavelli proud. He played European powers against each other, signing agreements with France and Russia that provided both weapons and political protection. When Italy tried to isolate Ethiopia diplomatically, they discovered that Menelik had already built relationships with their rivals. He also invested heavily in modernizing Ethiopia itself. Under his rule, the country got its first modern bank, postal system, telegraph lines, and railway. He understood that independence required more than military victory. It required building a modern state that could engage with the world on equal terms. The diplomatic trap, the Treaty of Wuchale. The most brilliant example of Menelik's strategic thinking came in 1889 with the Treaty of Wuchale. On the surface, this looked like a standard colonial agreement. Italy would provide weapons and money, Ethiopia would cede some northern territory. But Menelik had spotted something crucial. The treaty was written in both Italian and Amharic, and Article 17 had different meanings in each language. The Italian version said, Ethiopia must conduct all foreign relations through Italy, essentially making it a protectorate. The Amharic version said Ethiopia could use Italian diplomatic services if it chose to. When Italy began telling other European powers that Ethiopia was now an Italian protectorate, Menelik calmly pointed to the Amharic version and said they had misunderstood the agreement. In 1893, he formally denounced the entire treaty. This wasn't just clever diplomacy, it was a trap that exposed Italian duplicity to the world. The moment of truth, the Battle of Adwa. By 1896, diplomatic maneuvering had reached its limit. Italy decided to impose its protectorate by force, sending General Oreste Baratieri with 14,500 troops to subdue Ethiopia. What they found was an Ethiopian army of over 100,000 men, well armed with modern weapons and fighting on familiar ground. Menelik and Empress II had mobilized forces from across the empire, creating a coalition that represented the breadth of Ethiopian society. The Battle of Adwa on March 1, 1896 was a masterclass in how geography, preparation, and unity could defeat industrial superiority. Ethiopian forces used their knowledge of the terrain to surround and isolate Italian columns. When Italian artillery tried to slow the Ethiopian advance, they found themselves overwhelmed by wave after wave of coordinated attacks. The results were devastating for Italy. Over 6,000 Italian and colonial troops died, with another 3,800 captured, nearly 70% of the total force. Ethiopian casualties were higher in absolute numbers, but represented a smaller fraction of the massive army. The cultural foundation, unity through diversity. What made Ethiopian resistance possible wasn't just military strategy. It was a shared sense of identity that transcended ethnic and regional differences. The Amharic language played a crucial role in this unity. Unlike most African countries, where colonial languages became the lingua franca, Ethiopia already had a unifying language that predated European contact, Amharic. It had evolved from the ancient Ge'ez script and served as the language of administration, trade, and diplomacy across the empire. This linguistic unity allowed Menelik to communicate effectively with diverse regional leaders and coordinate resistance across vast distances. When the call went out to defend the empire, it reached every corner of Ethiopia in a language everyone could understand. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church reinforced this cultural unity. Unlike societies where Christianity was imposed by colonizers, Ethiopian Christianity was older than most European Christian traditions. It provided a sense of divine mission. Ethiopians weren't just defending territory, they were defending a sacred trust that went back to biblical times. The global impact, Adwa's legacy. The victory at Adwa sent shockwaves around the world. For the first time in the colonial era, an African army had decisively defeated a European power. The psychological impact was enormous. Across Africa and the African diaspora, Adwa became a symbol of what was possible. The Pan-African colors, green, yellow, and red, that appear on many African flags today, come from the Ethiopian flag, a tribute to this victory. Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, and other black leaders pointed to Ethiopia as proof that European superiority was a myth, not a fact. Italy was forced to sign the Treaty of Addis Ababa, formally recognizing Ethiopian independence and paying reparations. Other European powers who had initially supported Italian claims quietly began treating Ethiopia as a sovereign equal rather than a colonial target. The three key factors. Understanding why Ethiopia remained independent reveals three crucial factors that other African societies often lacked. First, institutional continuity. Ethiopia was already a functioning state with bureaucratic traditions, military organization, and diplomatic experience. When the colonial challenge came, they had institutional frameworks that could adapt and respond. Second, strategic leadership. Menelik II combined traditional Ethiopian strengths with modern innovations. He understood that independence required both military power and diplomatic sophistication. Third, geographic advantages. The Ethiopian highlands provided natural defensive benefits that made conquest extraordinarily difficult and expensive. European powers had to calculate whether the cost of conquering Ethiopia outweighed the potential benefits. The exception that proves the rule. Ethiopia's success also highlights why most other African societies couldn't replicate this achievement. The combination of geographic advantages, institutional development, military modernization, and strategic leadership was extremely rare. Most African societies faced European invasion while dealing with internal conflicts, technological disadvantages, or geographic vulnerabilities that Ethiopia managed to avoid or overcome. The scramble for Africa succeeded elsewhere, not because Africans couldn't fight, but because the specific conditions that allowed Ethiopian success were exceptional. The modern questions. Ethiopia's resistance to colonialism raises important questions about African development and identity. If Ethiopia could modernize on its own terms in the 1890s, what might other African societies have achieved without colonial disruption? The country's experience also shows that modernization doesn't require cultural surrender. Ethiopia adopted European technology and diplomatic practices while maintaining its own languages, religions, and political traditions. This suggests alternative paths to development that preserve cultural autonomy. However, Ethiopia's story isn't entirely triumphant. Menelik's empire-building campaigns in the south involved conquest and cultural domination that mirrored colonial practices elsewhere. The question of whether Ethiopia avoided colonialism or simply practiced it internally remains contentious. The lasting legacy. Today, when we look at Ethiopia's unique position in African history, we see both achievement and complexity. The country proved that African societies could resist European colonialism when conditions were right, but it also shows how rare those conditions were. Ethiopia's independence preserved something invaluable: proof that colonial period was not inevitable, that African societies had alternatives, and that resistance was possible. In a continent scarred by colonial borders and extractive economies, Ethiopia stands as evidence of what might have been. The next time someone suggests that European colonialism was somehow necessary for African development, remember Adwa. Remember that on March 1st, 1896, 100,000 Europeans proved that African societies could engage with modernity on their own terms, defending their sovereignty while embracing change. Ethiopia was never colonized because Ethiopians refused to accept that colonization was inevitable. And in refusing, they changed not just their own history, but the world's understanding of what African societies could achieve. What do you think? Does Ethiopia's story change how you view African history and the colonial period? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories about Africa's forgotten victories, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. See you next time.